A woman who's never raced before, a horse that trusts no one, and 1/2 mile run that will decide whether her family loses everything they've fought to keep alive. When Evelyn Mercer climbs onto Scout's back in front of half the county, she's not just racing for land, she's racing against a man who's never lost, a legend who's never been beaten, and a future that's already been decided by everyone except her. If you want to see how far courage can carry you when the entire world is betting against you, stay with me until the end. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can ride. The morning Thomas Aldridge saw Harlan Crow's dust cloud rising from the south road, he knew trouble was coming before the man ever reached the fence line. It was the kind of trouble that didn't announce itself with shouting or threats. It came quiet, measured, wrapped in expensive leather and polished brass. Crow rode a black gelding that morning, not his famous gray, which meant this wasn't a social call. Thomas set down the post he'd been digging and wiped his hands on his pants, watching the rider approach with the kind of stillness that came from years of reading men before they opened their mouths. Crow reined up just outside the gate. He didn't dismount. That was the first insult. Thomas. Harlan. The two men measured each other across 10 feet of Texas dirt. Crow was older by a decade, his face weathered into permanent lines of skepticism and control. He owned more land than any 3 families combined in this part of the county, and he'd built that empire one calculated move at a time. Thomas had watched him do it. Hell, half the county had watched him do it, and the other half had been swallowed up by it. I'll get straight to it, Crow said. You've got water I need. Thomas didn't blink. I've got water I use. North 40 Creek runs through your property for about 200 yards before it crosses into mine. During drought, that's the only reliable water source for 15 miles. You know that as well as I do. I do. Crow leaned forward slightly in his saddle. I'm prepared to make you an offer. I'm not interested in selling. I'm not offering to buy. Crow's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm offering you a race. Thomas felt the words settle into his chest like a stone. He knew what Crow was talking about before the man said another word. Everyone in the county knew about Crow's races. They were legend. Crow would challenge a man to a horse race, usually half a mile, sometimes a full mile if he was feeling generous. And he'd bet land, equipment, water rights, whatever was on the table. And Crow never lost. His gray quarter horse had crushed every challenger for the past 8 years. Men had tried to beat him with thoroughbreds, Mustangs, even a damn Arabian someone hauled in from El Paso. Didn't matter. Crow's gray was undefeated, and everyone knew it. You're out of your mind, Thomas said quietly. Am I? Crow straightened. Because from where I'm sitting, you've got 2 options. You can sell me access to that creek for a fair price, or you can race me for it. Winner takes the North 40 outright, 20 acres, water rights included. And if I say no to both? Crow's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped half a tone. Then I'll make sure every bank within 100 miles knows you're one bad season away from folding. I'll buy up your debts, call them in, and wait for you to drown. It'll take longer, but the result's the same. Thomas clenched his jaw. It wasn't an empty threat. Crow had done it before to smaller ranches, and he had the patience to do it again. The Aldridge Ranch was stable, but it wasn't bulletproof. One failed harvest, one hard winter, and they'd be vulnerable. Crow knew that. Thomas knew that. And now they both knew the other knew. When? Thomas asked. Saturday. Sunrise. Half-mile course along your fence line. You pick the horse, I'll bring mine. The whole county can watch if you want. I've got nothing to hide. And if I win? Crow's smile widened just slightly. You won't. He turned his horse and rode off without waiting for a response, leaving Thomas standing alone in the dirt with a decision that felt like swallowing glass. That night, Thomas sat at the dinner table with his daughter, Evelyn, and his ranch hand, Cormac, staring at a plate of food he wasn't eating. The lantern overhead flickered, casting shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the house. Evelyn watched her father with the quiet intensity she'd inherited from her late mother. Sharp eyes, sharper instincts, and a stubborn streak that had gotten her into trouble more times than Thomas cared to count. You're thinking about it, she said. Thomas didn't look up. Thinking about what? Racing Crow. Cormac, who'd been cutting into a piece of venison with more focus than it required, paused mid-slice. You can't be serious. I didn't say I was doing it. But you're thinking about it, Evelyn pressed. Thomas set down his fork. He's got me cornered, Evie. If I don't race him, he'll squeeze us out slow. If I do race him and lose, we lose the North 40 outright. Either way, he wins. So don't lose, Evelyn said simply. Cormac barked a laugh. Don't lose? You seen Crow's Gray? That horse is a damn machine. Nobody's beaten him in 8 years, not one rider. Then maybe nobody's ridden the right horse yet, Evelyn said. Thomas finally looked at her. What are you talking about? She hesitated, just for a second, then met his eyes straight on. Scout. The name landed in the room like a gunshot. Cormac stopped chewing. Thomas's expression went flat. No, Thomas said. You haven't even thought about it. I said no. Evelyn leaned forward. Scout's faster than anything we've got. You know that. Everyone knows that. Scout's also half wild and hasn't been raced in 2 years, and the only man who could ride him is too damn old to survive a full-speed run. Then find someone else. There is no one else, Thomas said, his voice rising slightly. That horse doesn't trust anybody. He barely tolerates Cormac, and Cormac's been feeding him for 3 years. Cormac nodded grimly. He's not wrong. Scout's got a mind like a steel trap and a temper to match. You put the wrong rider on him, he'll throw them into the fence line before they clear 50 yards. Evelyn sat back, frustration flickering across her face. But she didn't argue. Not yet. Scout lived in the farthest paddock, away from the other horses. He was a roan, dark red coat streaked with white, powerful chest, legs built for explosive speed. He'd been brought to the ranch 4 years ago by a drifter named Callahan, a man with a knife scar across his ribs and a reputation for breaking horses no one else could handle. Callahan had ridden Scout in 2 county races and won both by margins that made people nervous. Then he disappeared for a year, come back with a limp and a cough that sounded like death, and told Thomas he couldn't race anymore. Scout had been waiting ever since. Evelyn had started spending time with him about 8 months ago. Not riding him, Callahan had warned her off that, but just being near him. She'd bring him apples, brush his coat, talk to him while she mended tack or read under the cottonwood tree at the edge of the paddock. At first, Scout ignored her. Then he tolerated her. Then slowly, something shifted. She didn't tell anyone when Scout started lowering his head for her to scratch behind his ears. She didn't mention the way he'd follow her along the fence line when she walked the property at dusk. And she sure as hell didn't tell her father that she'd climbed onto Scout's back 3 times in the past month. No saddle, no bridle, just her and the horse moving together in the early morning light when no one else was awake. But Cormac had seen her once. He hadn't said anything, but the look he'd given her said enough. You're playing with fire, girl. Maybe she was, but fire didn't scare her as much as losing the ranch did. 2 days before the race, Thomas found Callahan sitting on the porch of the old bunkhouse, cleaning a rifle that didn't look like it had been fired in years. Callahan was thin now, his face gaunt, his hands steady but his breathing shallow. The knife wound he'd taken in a fight outside Amarillo had never healed right, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before it finished what it started. I need you to ride Scout, Thomas said without preamble. Callahan looked up slowly. No, you don't. Crow's got me backed into a corner. If I don't race him, I lose the North 40 anyway. Scout's the only horse fast enough to beat that gray. Scout's fast enough, Callahan agreed. But I'm not. You've ridden him before. I've ridden him when I wasn't half dead. Callahan set the rifle down. You put me on that horse at full speed, I'll last maybe a quarter mile before my ribs split open and I pass out. Then you lose the race, the land, and you've got my corpse to bury. That sound like a good plan to you? Thomas's jaw tightened. Then who the hell else can ride him? Callahan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Your daughter. Thomas stared at him. What? Evelyn. She's the only one that horse trusts besides me. Maybe more than me at this point. She's never raced. Neither had I, the first time. Callahan's voice was calm but firm. You think I learned how to ride Scout in some fancy stable? I learned by not dying, and your daughter's got something most riders don't. What's that? Patience. And nerve. Callahan leaned back against the bunkhouse wall. Scout doesn't need someone who's going to muscle him around. He needs someone who'll trust him. And she does. Thomas shook his head. I'm not putting my daughter on a half-wild horse in front of the entire county to race against Harlan Crow. Then you better come up with another plan, Callahan said quietly, because that's the only one that works. The night before the race, Evelyn found her father standing at the paddock fence, staring at Scout. The roan was grazing near the far end, his coat catching the last light of the sunset. Thomas didn't turn when she walked up beside him. You're not going to do it, are you? She said. I don't know yet. Yes, you do. You're too scared. Thomas's voice went sharp. Damn right I'm scared. You think I want to watch you break your neck in front of half the county? You think I want to watch you lose this ranch because you were too stubborn to let me help? He turned to face her. This isn't about stubbornness. Then what is it about? Evelyn's voice rose. Because from where I'm standing, you've got one option that works and you're too proud to take it. It's not pride. Then what? Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment Evelyn saw something she didn't expect. Fear. Not the kind that came from facing Crow or losing land, the kind that came from watching the only family you had left walk into danger you couldn't control. You're all I've got, Evie, he said quietly. If something happens to you, nothing's going to happen. You don't know that. Neither do you. She stepped closer. But I know Scout, and I know I can do this. Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he let out a slow breath. If you get hurt, I won't. If you do, I'll never forgive myself. Then I won't, she said again, and this time she smiled just a little. Trust me, Dad. He wanted to argue. He wanted to find another way, another option, some miracle that didn't involve his daughter riding a half-wild horse against the most dangerous man in the county. But there wasn't one, and deep down, he knew it. All right, he said finally. But we do this my way. You ride Scout tomorrow morning before the race. Just you and him. If he throws you, we call it off. Evelyn nodded. Deal. The sky was still dark when Evelyn walked out to the paddock the next morning. The air was cool, the kind of cool that made everything feel sharper, more alive. Scout was already awake, standing near the gate like he'd been waiting for her. She climbed over the fence and approached him slowly, her boots crunching softly in the dirt. Scout's ears flicked forward. His eyes tracked her every movement, but he didn't back away. Hey, boy, she said quietly. Big day today. She reached out and ran her hand along his neck. His coat was warm, his muscles tense but not afraid. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm, steady and strong. I need you to trust me, she whispered, just like I trust you. Scout turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers, and then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head and pressed his muzzle against her shoulder. Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not doubt, just certainty. She swung herself onto his back, no saddle, no bridle, just her hands tangled in his mane and her legs wrapped around his ribs. Scout shifted beneath her, testing her weight, her balance, her intent. Then, without any signal from her, he started walking. They moved through the paddock together, slow at first, then faster. Evelyn didn't pull, didn't push, didn't try to control him. She just moved with him, letting her body follow the rhythm of his stride. And Scout responded. His walk became a trot, his trot became a canter, and then, suddenly, he was running. Evelyn felt the world blur around her. The fence line whipped past. The wind tore at her hair. Scout's hooves pounded the earth with a sound like thunder, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn understood what Callahan had meant. Scout didn't need someone to control him. He needed someone who wouldn't try. When they finally slowed near the far end of the paddock, Evelyn was breathing hard, her heart racing, her hands shaking from adrenaline. But she was smiling, and when she looked down at Scout, she could swear the damn horse was smiling too. Behind her, standing at the fence, Thomas and Cormac watched in silence. Well, Cormac said finally, I'll be damned. Thomas didn't say anything. He just nodded once, slow and certain, and walked back toward the house to prepare for the race that would decide everything. By the time the sun broke over the eastern hills, half the county had already gathered along the fence line. Word had spread fast. Harlan Crow challenging Thomas Aldridge to a race wasn't just news, it was spectacle. Men rode in from neighboring ranches, some bringing their families, others bringing whiskey. Women set up chairs and wagon beds to get a better view. Kids climbed fence posts and hung off the rails like they were watching a bullfight. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when Crow's undefeated gray faced whatever poor bastard Thomas had dug up to ride against him. Nobody expected to see Evelyn. She stood near the starting line with Scout, one hand resting on his neck, her face calm in a way that didn't match the chaos building around her. She'd tied her hair back tight, worn her oldest boots, and stripped down to a plain cotton shirt and work pants that wouldn't catch the wind. Scout stood beside her like a statue, his ears swiveling toward the crowd, but his body perfectly still. He didn't paw the ground, he didn't toss his head. He just waited. Thomas stood a few feet away, talking in low tones with Cormac and Callahan. Callahan looked worse than he had 2 days ago, his face gray, his breathing labored. But he'd insisted on being there. He knew what was at stake. They all did. "She ready?" Cormac asked, glancing toward Evelyn. Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched his daughter run her hand along Scout's shoulder, her movements easy and sure, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Maybe she had. He still wasn't sure when that had happened, when his daughter had stopped being a girl who helped with the chickens and started being a woman who could ride a horse nobody else could touch. "She better be," Thomas said finally. Callahan coughed into his hand, then straightened. "She is. You just gotta trust her." "I do trust her. It's the rest of this I don't trust." Cormac nodded toward the far end of the fence line, where Harlan Crow had just arrived on horseback, his gray quarter horse trailing behind him on a lead. The gray was a magnificent animal. Clean lines, powerful haunches, a coat that shone like polished stone in the early light. Crow dismounted slowly, his expression unreadable, and began checking the gray's tack with the kind of calm precision that came from absolute confidence. "He doesn't know yet," Cormac said quietly. "Know what?" "That she's riding." Cormac's mouth twitched. "This is going to be real interesting." Crow finished with his horse and turned toward the starting line. His eyes swept over the crowd, taking in the faces, the noise, the anticipation. Then his gaze landed on Evelyn, and for the first time that morning, his expression changed. Not much. Just a slight narrowing of the eyes, a faint tightening around his mouth. He walked over slowly, his boots crunching in the dirt, and stopped about 10 feet from where Thomas stood. "That your rider?" Crow asked, nodding toward Evelyn. "That's her." Crow looked at Evelyn, then at Scout, then back at Thomas. "You're joking." "I'm not." "You're putting a woman on a horse in a half-mile sprint against the best quarter horse in the county." "That's right." Crow's jaw worked for a moment, like he was chewing on something bitter. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're out of your damn mind." "Maybe," Thomas said evenly, "but she's riding, and we're racing. That a problem?" Crow stared at him for a long moment. The crowd had gone quieter now, sensing the tension. People leaned in, trying to catch every word. "No problem," Crow said finally, "but when she breaks her neck, that's on you." "When you lose," Thomas said, his voice low and hard, "that's on you." Crow's expression went flat. He turned without another word and walked back toward his horse, his shoulders stiff with barely controlled anger. Cormac let out a slow breath. "Well, you just pissed him off real good." "Good," Thomas said. "Angry men make mistakes." Callahan coughed again, harder this time, then steadied himself against the fence. "She's going to need every advantage she can get. Crow's gray doesn't lose focus, ever." Thomas looked at Evelyn again. She was still standing with Scout, her hand on his neck, her lips moving in what might have been words or might have been nothing at all. Scout's ears flicked toward her, then forward again, and Thomas realized something he hadn't fully understood until that moment. His daughter wasn't just riding this horse, she was riding with him. One of Crow's men, a broad-shouldered ranch hand named Boone, stepped forward to lay out the rules. He had a voice like gravel and a face that had seen too many bar fights, but he was fair, and everyone knew it. That's why Crow had picked him to call the race. "Half mile," Boone announced, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Start here at the fence post, straight shot east along the property line, turn at the cottonwood tree, then back to the start. First rider to cross the line wins. No interference, no shortcuts, no second chances. Anyone got a problem with that?" Nobody spoke. Boone looked at Thomas. "You good?" Thomas nodded. Boone looked at Crow. "You good?" Crow didn't answer, but he swung up onto his gray with the kind of smooth, practiced ease that made it clear he'd done this 100 times before. The gray shifted beneath him, muscles rippling, ready to explode forward at the first signal. Evelyn approached Scout and paused, her hand resting on his shoulder. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing in time with the horse, letting the noise of the crowd fade into the background. Then she swung herself up onto his back. Still no saddle, still no bridle, just her and the horse, and the trust they'd built in the quiet mornings when no one else was watching. Scout didn't flinch. He didn't shy. He just stood there, solid and certain, waiting for her to be ready. The crowd murmured. A woman's voice somewhere in the back said, "She's riding bareback?" And someone else laughed, sharp and dismissive. Evelyn heard it. She didn't care. She leaned forward slightly, her mouth close to Scout's ear. "Just you and me, boy. That's all this is." Scout's ears flicked back toward her voice, then forward again. Boone raised his hand. "Riders ready?" Crow didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his hand steady on the reins. Evelyn took a breath, felt Scout's heartbeat under her legs, and nodded once. Boone dropped his hand. "Go!" The gray exploded forward like a cannonball, his hooves tearing into the dirt with a sound like thunder. Crow leaned low over the horse's neck, his body perfectly aligned, every ounce of his weight driving the animal forward. The crowd roared. Dust kicked up in a thick cloud, and within seconds, the gray had opened up a 3-length lead. Scout didn't move. For a heartbeat, maybe 2. He just stood there, perfectly still, while Evelyn's stomach dropped into her boots. She didn't kick him, didn't shout, didn't panic. She just waited. And then Scout launched. It wasn't a gradual acceleration. It was an explosion of muscle and speed that nearly unseated her. Evelyn grabbed a fistful of his mane and clamped her legs tight, her body moving instinctively with the sudden surge of power beneath her. Scout's hooves hit the ground in a rapid, pounding rhythm that felt like her own heartbeat magnified 100 times. The crowd's roar became a wall of sound, but Evelyn didn't hear it. All she heard was the wind and Scout's breathing and the thunderous drumbeat of his stride. Crow's gray was still ahead. 4 lengths, maybe 5. But Scout was closing the gap fast. Too fast. Evelyn felt the raw power coiled in the horse's body, the way he stretched out with each stride, eating up the ground like he'd been starving for it. She didn't try to control him. She just moved with him, her body low and tight against his neck, her hands tangled in his mane, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. They hit the first quarter-mile mark, and Scout pulled even with the gray's hindquarters. Crow glanced back, his eyes widening for just a fraction of a second, and then he drove his heels into the gray's sides, demanding more speed. The gray responded. The animal was a machine, all power and precision, and it opened up the gap again by half a length. But Scout didn't slow. If anything, he pushed harder, his muscles bunching and releasing with a rhythm that felt almost supernatural. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not doubt, but a kind of wild clarity. She realized she wasn't just trusting Scout to run. She was trusting him to know how to run. And he did. He knew when to push, when to hold back, when to adjust his stride for the uneven ground beneath them. All she had to do was stay on. The cottonwood tree came into view, its wide trunk marking the turn. Crow leaned hard into the curve, guiding the gray with sharp, controlled movements. The horse turned cleanly, its hooves digging into the dirt, and came out of the turn with barely any loss of speed. Evelyn didn't guide Scout at all. She just shifted her weight slightly, leaning into the turn the way she'd learned by instinct over the past few months, and Scout responded like they were the same creature. He cut the turn tighter than the gray, his body low and balanced, and when he came out of it, he was only a length behind. The crowd was screaming now, a wall of noise that felt like it could shake the ground. People were on their feet, some of them shouting Evelyn's name, others shouting for Crow, most of them just shouting because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Thomas stood frozen at the fence line, his hands gripping the wood so hard his knuckles had gone white. Cormac was yelling something beside him, but Thomas couldn't hear it. All he could see was his daughter, low on Scout's back, her face set with fierce concentration as the roan tore across the dirt like a wildfire. Callahan leaned against the fence, his breathing ragged, his face pale, but he was smiling. "That's it, girl," he whispered. "That's it." The second quarter mile stretched out ahead, a straight shot back to the starting line. Crow glanced back again, and this time, Evelyn saw something flicker across his face. Not fear, not yet. But doubt. Scout surged forward again, pulling even with the gray's shoulder. The two horses ran side by side now, their hooves pounding in near-perfect synchronization, their bodies stretched out in full sprint. Evelyn could see the gray's muscles working, could see the foam starting to gather at the corners of its mouth. The horse was giving everything it had, so was Scout. But Scout wasn't struggling, he was flying. Evelyn felt the change in his stride, a subtle shift, a slight lengthening of his reach. And she realized he had more to give. He'd been holding back, waiting for the right moment, and now he was ready to unleash it. She leaned forward, her mouth close to his ear again. Go. Scout didn't need to be told twice. He shot forward like he'd been struck by lightning, his body surging with a burst of speed that left the gray half a length behind in the space of 3 strides. Crow shouted something. Evelyn couldn't hear it over the wind and the pounding hooves, and drove his heels into the gray again, demanding more. But the gray had nothing left. Scout pulled ahead by a full length, then 2, his hooves tearing up the ground in great clods of dirt that sprayed behind them. The fence line blurred past. The crowd became a smear of faces and noise. And then, suddenly, the starting line was right there, 10 yards away, and Scout crossed it a full 3 lengths ahead of Crow's gray. The crowd exploded. Evelyn barely had time to process it. Scout slowed gradually, his breathing heavy but controlled, and she let him carry her another 50 yards before he finally came to a stop near the far end of the paddock. She slid off his back on shaking legs and nearly collapsed, her knees buckling from the adrenaline crash. Scout turned his head and nudged her shoulder, his dark eyes calm and steady, like he'd just finished a casual morning trot instead of the most important race of his life. "You did it," Evelyn whispered, her voice hoarse. "You did it, you crazy bastard!" Scout snorted, tossed his head once, and then lowered it to graze like nothing had happened. Back at the starting line, Thomas was already moving. He shoved through the crowd, ignoring the hands that clapped his shoulders and the voices shouting congratulations, and didn't stop until he reached Evelyn. She looked up at him, her face flushed, her hair wild, her eyes bright with something he hadn't seen in her since her mother died. "You all right?" he asked, his voice tight. "I'm fine." "You sure?" "Dad, I'm fine." She grinned, sudden and fierce. "We won." Thomas pulled her into a hard, quick hug, the kind that didn't need words. When he let go, his hands were shaking, and he didn't care who saw it. Cormac appeared a moment later, breathing hard from running, his face split with a grin so wide it looked painful. "I'll be damned. I'll be damned. That was the fastest half-mile I've ever seen in my life." Callahan was slower to arrive, leaning heavily on the fence, but his expression was satisfied in a way that made him look 10 years younger. "Told you," he said to Thomas. "Told you she could do it." Thomas nodded, still too rattled to speak. Across the field, Harlan Crow sat motionless on his gray, staring at the starting line like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. His face was stone, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. The crowd around him had gone quieter now, the celebration muted by the realization that they'd just witnessed something nobody thought was possible. Crow's undefeated streak was over. Boone walked over to Crow's horse, his expression carefully neutral. "You want to dispute the result?" Crow didn't answer for a long moment. Then he dismounted slowly, his movements stiff, and looked Boone in the eye. "No." "Then the North 40 goes to Aldridge, 20 acres, water rights included. That clear?" Crow's jaw worked. "It's clear." He turned and led this gray away without another word, the crowd parting silently to let him through. Nobody cheered, nobody mocked him. They just watched him go, and the weight of that silence said more than any words could have. Thomas watched him leave, and for the first time in 6 years, he felt like he could breathe. The celebration that followed was loud and chaotic, and exactly what Thomas needed. Men pressed cups of whiskey into his hands, women hugged Evelyn until she thought her ribs might crack, and kids swarmed around Scout like he was some kind of mythical creature. Scout tolerated it with surprising patience, though he kept one eye on Evelyn the entire time, making sure she was close. By mid-morning, most of the crowd had dispersed, heading back to their own ranches with stories they'd be telling for the next decade. Thomas stood near the paddock with Cormac, watching Evelyn brush Scout down while Callahan sat on a nearby stump, looking exhausted but content. "You realize what you just did, right?" Cormac said. Thomas took a sip of whiskey, savoring the burn. won a race. You didn't just win a race, you broke Crow. That man's been untouchable for 8 years, and you just humiliated him in front of half the county. Good, Cormac snorted. You better hope good is all it is. Crow doesn't forget things like this. Thomas set the cup down and turned to face Cormac. I know, but right now, I don't care. We've got water, we've got land, and we've got a future. That's more than we had 3 days ago. Cormac nodded slowly. Fair enough. Callahan coughed, then looked up at Thomas. You know this doesn't end here, right? What do you mean? Crow's got pride, and men with pride don't just walk away when they lose. They find a way to win the next round. Thomas's jaw tightened. Then we'll deal with it when it comes. Callahan didn't argue, but the look in his eyes said he didn't believe it would be that simple. That night, after the last of the visitors had left and the ranch had settled into its usual quiet, Thomas sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a fresh cup of coffee in his hands. The North 40 stretched out in front of him, dark and still under the stars, and for the first time in years, it felt like it really belonged to him. Evelyn came out a few minutes later and sat down beside him without a word. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of the creek running through the property. You scared? She asked finally. Of what? What happens next? Thomas thought about it. Yeah, a little. Me too. He looked at her. You didn't look scared out there. I wasn't. Not when I was on scout. She paused. But now that it's over, I keep thinking about what could have gone wrong. What if he'd thrown me? What if I'd fallen? What if... But you didn't, Thomas said quietly. You stayed on, you trusted him, and you won. That's what matters. Evelyn nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Thomas reached over and squeezed her shoulder. You did something today that most people wouldn't have had the guts to try. You saved this ranch, and I'm proud of you. Evelyn's throat tightened, and she had to look away before she started crying. Thanks, Dad. They sat together until the coffee went cold and the stars began to fade, and neither of them said another word. But out in the paddock, Scout stood near the fence, his ears pricked forward, his eyes watching the darkness beyond the property line. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew something was, and he was ready. 3 days passed before Harlan Crow made his next move. Thomas was in the barn repairing a bridle when Cormac came in fast, his boots pounding against the dirt floor, his face flushed with something between anger and alarm. Crow's at the property line, Cormac said. South fence. He's got 4 men with him. Thomas set the bridle down slowly. Armed? Didn't see rifles, but they're not here for a social call. Thomas grabbed his hat and walked out into the afternoon heat, Cormac falling into step beside him. Evelyn was near the well, hauling up a bucket of water, and she straightened when she saw them moving with purpose toward the south end of the property. What's going on? She called. Stay here, Thomas said without looking back. Like hell I will. He stopped and turned. Evelyn, I'm coming. There wasn't time to argue. Thomas nodded once, sharp and frustrated, and kept walking. Evelyn set the bucket down and followed. They reached the south fence 10 minutes later. Crow was there, sitting on his black gelding with 4 ranch hands spread out behind him. None of them had rifles drawn, but Thomas noticed every one of them wore sidearms, and their hands stayed close to their belts. Crow himself looked composed, his face calm, but there was something cold and deliberate in the way he watched Thomas approach. Harlan, Thomas said evenly. Thomas. Crow's eyes flicked to Evelyn, then back. Didn't expect to see the girl. She goes where she wants. Crow's mouth twitched, but he didn't comment. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Got something for you. He tossed it over the fence. The paper landed in the dirt near Thomas's boots. Thomas picked it up, unfolded it, and read in silence. His jaw tightened with every line. What is it? Cormac asked. Thomas handed him the paper without a word. Cormac scanned it, his expression darkening. You've got to be kidding me. What? Evelyn stepped closer, trying to see. Cormac looked at her, then at Thomas. It's a lien. Crow's claiming Thomas owes him for damages to his property during the race. Evelyn's eyes went wide. What damages? There weren't any damages. Crow leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Fence posts. 3 of them got knocked loose when your horse cut the turn too tight. That's destruction of property. That's horseshit, Cormac said flatly. That's the law. Crow's voice stayed calm, measured. I've got witnesses who'll testify to it. And unless Thomas pays for repairs, plus penalties for negligence, I'm filing a claim with the county courthouse. Thomas stared at him. How much? $200. The number hit like a punch. $200 was more than most ranchers made in 6 months. It was enough to cripple the Aldridge operation for a year, maybe longer, and Crow knew it. You don't have $200 worth of damage, Thomas said, his voice tight. I've got 3 broken fence posts and a written assessment from a county surveyor. You want to dispute it, take it up with the court. And how long does that take? Crow smiled faintly. 6 months. Maybe more. Thomas felt the trap close around him. If he fought this in court, it would drag on long enough to bleed him dry in legal fees. If he didn't fight it, he'd have to pay a sum he didn't have. Either way, Crow won. You son of a bitch, Evelyn said quietly. Crow's eyes shifted to her, and for a moment his expression hardened. You cost me something, girl. Now I'm collecting. You lost fair, she shot back. This is you being a sore loser. This is me protecting my property. If your father can't control his animals, that's not my problem. Thomas stepped forward, his hand gripping the fence post. You want your money? Fine. But it'll take time. You've got 30 days, Crow said. After that, I take it to the courthouse and put a lien on your land, starting with the North 40. The words hung in the air like a threat carved in stone. Crow held Thomas's gaze for another long moment, then turned his horse and rode off, his men following in silence. Thomas stood there staring at the dust cloud they left behind, his mind racing through options he didn't have. He can't do this, Evelyn said, her voice shaking with anger. He's making it up. Doesn't matter if he's making it up, Cormac said grimly. If he's got a surveyor's report and witnesses, the court'll side with him until Thomas can prove otherwise. And proving otherwise costs money we don't have. Thomas crumpled the paper in his fist. He planned this. Of course he did, Cormac said. You embarrassed him. Now he's hitting back the only way he knows how. Evelyn turned to her father. So what do we do? Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked out over the property, the fields, the barn, the North 40 stretching out toward the creek, and felt the weight of it pressing down on him like a physical thing. We figure it out, he said finally. We always do. But his voice didn't carry the certainty it usually did, and Evelyn heard it. That night, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him, numbers scrawled across the page in messy columns. He'd been at it for 2 hours, adding and subtracting, moving money around on paper like it might magically multiply if he stared at it long enough. It didn't. Cormac sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. How bad is it? Bad. Thomas rubbed his eyes. We've got maybe $60 in savings. Another 40 if we sell off some equipment we don't technically need. That gets us to 100. Still 100 short. Yeah. What about the cattle? We could sell early. Market's down right now. We'd lose money, and we need that stock for next year's breeding. Sell now, and we cripple ourselves long term. Cormac frowned. So what's left? Thomas didn't answer. He just stared at the ledger, his jaw working. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, still dressed, her hair loose around her shoulders. I've got an idea. Both men looked up. No, Thomas said immediately. You don't even know what I'm going to say. Yes, I do, and the answer's no. Evelyn stepped into the room. There's another race next month, big one, over in Fletcher County. Winner takes $300. Thomas's expression went flat. Absolutely not. Why not? Scout's faster than anything Crow's got. He's probably faster than anything in Fletcher County, too. You don't know that. I know he beat the best horse in this county without breaking a sweat. That was luck. That wasn't luck, and you know it. Evelyn crossed her arms. Scout's the fastest horse I've ever seen. If we enter him in that race and win, we've got the money to pay Crow and still have enough left over to keep the ranch running. Cormac was quiet, his eyes moving between father and daughter. Finally, he said, She's not wrong. Thomas shot him a look. Don't. I'm just saying it's an option. It's a bad option. Fletcher County races are rough. They don't have rules like we do here. Half the riders cheat, and the other half don't care if someone gets hurt. Then we'll be careful, Evelyn said. Careful doesn't mean safe. Nothing about this is safe, Dad. Crow's got us cornered. If we don't come up with that money, we lose the North 40 anyway. At least this way, we've got a chance. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm not risking your life for $300. It's not just $300. It's the ranch. It's everything we've worked for. Evelyn's voice rose, frustration spilling over. You think I'm scared? I'm not. I've already done this once, and I can do it again. That was different. How? How was it different? Because I didn't have a choice. Thomas's voice cracked, and for a moment the room went completely silent. He took a breath, steadying himself. I didn't have a choice then, but I do now, and I'm not letting you do this. Evelyn stared at him, her eyes bright with anger and something else. Hurt, maybe. So what then? We just give up? Let Crow take everything? We find another way. There is no other way. Thomas didn't respond. He just stood there, his hands braced against the table, his shoulders tight with tension. Evelyn waited for him to say something, anything. When he didn't, she turned and walked out, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Cormac watched her go, then looked at Thomas. You know she's right. I know. So why won't you let her do it? Thomas sat down slowly, his hands shaking. Because I can't lose her, Cormac. I can't. She's all I've got left. Cormac was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You already lost her once, when her mother died. You know what brought her back? Thomas looked up. Letting her fight her own battles, Cormac said. You can't protect her from everything, and if you try, you'll just push her away. Thomas didn't answer. He just stared at the ledger, the numbers blurring together, and wondered when protecting his daughter had started to feel like the wrong thing to do. 2 days later, Evelyn found Callahan sitting outside the bunkhouse, whittling a piece of wood into something that might have been a horse, or might have been nothing at all. He looked worse than he had at the race, his face gaunt, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes were still sharp. You look like you've got something on your mind, he said, without looking up. Evelyn sat down beside him. There's a race in Fletcher County next month, $300 to the winner. Callahan stopped whittling. And you want to enter Scout? Yeah. Your father know about this? He said no. Callahan nodded slowly. Smart man. So you think it's a bad idea, too? I didn't say that. He set the wood down and looked at her. I think it's dangerous, but I also think you're right. Scout's fast enough to win. Question is whether you're ready for what that race is going to throw at you. What do you mean? Callahan leaned back against the wall. Fletcher County races aren't like what you did here. They're dirty. Riders will cut you off, box you in, sometimes worse. I've seen men get thrown on purpose. I've seen horses go down because someone drove them into a fence. If you go into that race thinking it's going to be fair, you're going to get hurt. Evelyn's jaw tightened. So what do I do? You ride smart. You don't let anyone get close enough to box you in, and you trust Scout to know when something's wrong. He paused. But more than that, you got to be ready to lose, because if you go in there thinking you have to win, you'll take risks you shouldn't, and that's when things go bad. I can't afford to lose. Nobody can. But you go in there desperate, and you'll make mistakes. Callahan picked up the wood again and turned it over in his hands. Scout's faster than most horses I've seen, but speed doesn't mean much if you're not smart enough to use it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Will you help me train? Callahan looked at her, his expression unreadable. Your father's not going to like that. I know. He studied her face, then let out a slow breath. All right, but we do it my way. No shortcuts, no heroics. You listen to what I tell you, or we stop. Deal? Deal. Callahan nodded. Then we start tomorrow, sunrise. For the next 2 weeks, Evelyn and Scout trained in the early mornings before the ranch woke up. Callahan pushed her harder than she expected, making her ride the same stretches over and over until she could navigate them with her eyes closed. He taught her how to read the ground, how to anticipate turns, how to shift her weight so Scout could move faster without losing balance. But more than that, he taught her how to stay calm when everything around her was chaos. Races like this, everyone's going to be yelling, Callahan said one morning, watching her guide Scout through a tight turn. Crowd, other riders, even the horses. You let that noise get in your head, you're done. You gotta block it out. Focus on Scout, and let him focus on the ground. Everything else is just distraction. Evelyn nodded, her breathing steady. Got it. And if someone tries to box you in, don't fight them. Let Scout find the gap. He's smarter than most people give him credit for. What if there's no gap? Then you make one, but you don't force it. You wait for the right moment, and when it comes, you take it fast. They ran drills until Evelyn's legs ached, and her hands were raw from gripping Scout's mane. But she didn't complain. Every morning she showed up ready to work, and every morning Scout was waiting for her. Thomas noticed, of course. He didn't say anything at first, but Evelyn could feel his disapproval in the way he avoided looking at her during meals, the way he stayed in the barn longer than he needed to. It wasn't until the end of the second week that he finally confronted her. She was brushing Scout down after a training run when Thomas walked into the paddock, his expression hard. "You're still planning to do this," he said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn didn't stop brushing. "Yeah, even though I told you no. You told me you didn't want me to. That's not the same thing." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You're going to get yourself killed, or I'm going to win $300 and save the ranch. It's not worth it. It is to me." Evelyn set the brush down and turned to face him. "Dad, I get it. You're scared. I'm scared too. But sitting here doing nothing isn't going to make Crow go away. We need that money, and this is the only way to get it." "There are other ways." "Name one." Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't have an answer. Evelyn softened slightly. "I know you're trying to protect me, but you can't. Not from this. All you can do is trust me." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his expression torn between anger and fear and something that looked a lot like resignation. Finally, he said, "If you do this, you do it smart. No taking risks you don't have to. You understand?" "I understand." "And if something goes wrong, it won't." "If it does," Thomas continued, his voice firm, "you pull out. I don't care if you're in the lead. If Scout gets hurt, if you get hurt, you stop. Deal?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "Deal." Thomas didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. He just turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn alone with Scout and the weight of what she'd just promised. The day before the race, Callahan pulled Evelyn aside after training and handed her a small leather pouch. "What's this?" she asked. "Emergency kit, bandages, salve, a knife. You probably won't need it, but better to have it." Evelyn tucked the pouch into her saddlebag. "Thanks." Callahan nodded, then hesitated. "You nervous?" "Yeah." "Good. Means you're paying attention." He paused. "You're going to do fine, Evelyn. Scout trusts you, and that's worth more than anything I could teach you. What if I mess up?" "Then you mess up. But you don't quit." Callahan's voice was steady, certain. "That's the difference between people who win and people who don't. Winners mess up all the time. They just don't quit." Evelyn looked at him, then smiled faintly. "You sound like my mom." Callahan's expression softened. "She'd be proud of you, you know. What you're doing. The person you're becoming." Evelyn's throat tightened and she had to look away. "Thanks, Callahan. Don't thank me yet. Thank me after you win." That night, Thomas, Evelyn, and Cormac sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the property. Nobody spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came from knowing words wouldn't change anything. Finally, Thomas said, "You ready?" Evelyn nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." "You remember what I said about pulling out if things go wrong?" "I remember." Thomas looked at her, his expression serious. "I mean it, Evie. I'd rather lose the ranch than lose you." Evelyn reached over and squeezed his hand. "I know." They sat together until the stars came out, and when Evelyn finally went to bed, she didn't sleep. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling, running through every turn, every signal, every lesson Callahan had drilled into her over the past 2 weeks. And in the paddock outside, Scout stood watch, his ears pricked forward, his body still and steady in the darkness. The race was tomorrow, and everything they'd worked for, everything they'd fought to keep, would be decided in the next few minutes of their lives. Evelyn closed her eyes and tried not to think about what would happen if she failed. They left for Fletcher County before dawn. the wagon rattling over uneven ground while Scout trailed behind on a lead rope. Thomas drove, his hands tight on the reins, his jaw set in that way that meant he was thinking too hard about things he couldn't control. Cormac sat beside him, quiet and watchful. Evelyn rode in the back with the supplies, her eyes on Scout, watching the way he moved in the half-light. The horse looked calm, too calm maybe, like he knew what was coming and had already decided he was ready for it. Evelyn wished she felt the same. They reached Fletcher County just after sunrise, and the difference hit her immediately. This wasn't like the race at home, where neighbors gathered to watch and cheer and maybe place a friendly bet. This was something else entirely. The makeshift track stretched along a dried-up riverbed, the ground hard-packed and rutted with old hoofprints. Wooden barriers marked the turns, and a rough crowd had already gathered along the edges. Men with hard faces and harder voices, women in worn dresses holding children who looked like they'd seen too much too young. There were maybe a dozen horses staged near the starting line, and Evelyn's stomach dropped when she saw them. These weren't ranch horses or work animals. These were racers, lean, muscled, built for speed, and nothing else. Their riders looked just as mean, scanning the competition with the kind of cold calculation that made it clear this wasn't about pride or honor. It was about money, and people who needed money didn't play fair. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop near the edge of the crowd and set the brake. "We've still got time to turn around." Evelyn jumped down from the wagon. "We're not turning around. Evie, I'm doing this, Dad." Thomas looked at her, his expression tight, then nodded once and climbed down. Cormac followed, his eyes already sweeping the crowd, reading the layout, the faces, the angles. "Stay close," Cormac said quietly. "This crowd doesn't look friendly." "No kidding," Evelyn muttered. She led Scout towards the registration area, a rickety table set up under a canvas awning where a man with a scarred face and missing fingers was taking names. He looked up when Evelyn approached, his eyes flicking from her to Scout and back again. "Entry fee's $10, he said. Evelyn handed over the money. The man counted it slowly, then scribbled her name on a piece of paper without asking for it. "What's the horse's name?" "Scout." The man wrote it down, then looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "You know what kind of race this is, girl?" "I know." "You sure? Because I've seen plenty of riders come in here thinking they're tough, and most of them don't finish. Some don't even make it past the first turn." "I'll finish." The man shrugged. "Your funeral." He handed her a number scrawled on a piece of cloth. "Tie that to your arm. Race starts in an hour." Evelyn took the number and walked back to where Thomas and Cormac were waiting. Thomas's face was grim, but he didn't say anything. He just helped her tie the number to her arm, his fingers fumbling slightly with the knot. "You remember what Callahan taught you?" he asked. "Every word." "Good, because these riders aren't going to give you any room. You see an opening, you take it. You don't. You wait. Don't force anything." "I know." Thomas paused, then pulled her into a quick, hard hug. "Be careful." "I will." When he let go, Evelyn could see the fear in his eyes, barely hidden under the surface. She wanted to say something reassuring, something that would make him believe she'd be okay. But she didn't know if she believed it herself, so she just nodded and turned toward Scout. The hour passed too fast. Evelyn spent it walking Scout around the staging area, letting him get used to the noise, the other horses, the tension crackling through the air like static before a storm. Scout seemed unbothered, his ears swiveling toward the sounds, but his body calm and steady. She wished she could borrow some of that calm for herself. When the call came to line up, Evelyn swung onto Scout's back and guided him toward the starting line. The other riders were already there, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground, their eyes cold and calculating. Evelyn found a spot near the middle of the pack and held Scout steady, her hands tangled in his mane, her heart pounding so hard she thought the riders next to her might hear it. A man to her left, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his cheek, glanced over at her and smirked. "You lost, sweetheart?" Evelyn didn't answer. "I'm serious. This ain't a place for girls playing dress-up. You're going to get hurt." "Then mind your own business and ride your own race," Evelyn said, her voice flat. The man's smirk widened. "All right. Don't say I didn't warn you." The race marshal stepped forward, a different man this time, older and meaner looking, with a voice that cut through the noise like a blade. "1.5 miles, down the riverbed, around the cottonwood grove, back to the start. No rules except you cross the line first. Anyone tries to sabotage another rider's horse, they're disqualified. Everything else is fair game. Understood?" Nobody answered. The riders just stared straight ahead, their bodies tense, waiting for the signal. The marshal raised his hand. "On my mark." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Scout shifted beneath her, his muscles coiling, ready to explode. The marshal dropped his hand. "Go!" The starting line erupted into chaos. Horses lunged forward in a tangled mass of hooves and dust and shouting riders. Evelyn felt Scout surge beneath her, his body uncoiling with that same explosive power she'd felt during the race against Crow. But this time, there were bodies everywhere. Horses cutting in front of her, riders jostling for position, elbows flying as people fought for the inside track. Scout didn't panic. He drove forward, finding gaps in the pack that Evelyn didn't even see until they were already through them. A black stallion cut in front of them, too close, and Scout shifted left without her signaling, his instincts faster than her thoughts. A rider to her right swung wide on a turn, nearly clipping her leg, but Scout surged ahead just in time, leaving the rider cursing behind them. The riverbed was worse than Evelyn had imagined. The ground was uneven, rutted with old channels and hidden rocks that could snap a horse's leg if they hit wrong. Dust kicked up in thick clouds, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Evelyn leaned low over Scout's neck, her eyes streaming from the grit, her lungs burning as she tried to breathe through the chaos. A rider in front of her went down hard, his horse stumbling over a rut and throwing him into the dirt. Evelyn barely had time to react before Scout jumped clean over the fallen rider, his body arcing through the air with terrifying precision. They landed hard, the impact jarring through Evelyn's spine, but Scout didn't slow. He just kept driving forward, his hooves pounding the earth in a relentless rhythm. By the time they hit the first turn, half the pack had already fallen behind. Evelyn could see 3 riders ahead of her: the man with the scar, a woman on a gray mare, and a lean, wiry rider on a chestnut that moved like lightning. The woman glanced back, saw Evelyn gaining, and drove her heels into the mare's sides, demanding more speed. Scout closed the gap anyway. The cottonwood grove loomed ahead, a tight cluster of trees marking the turn. The lead riders hit it fast, cutting hard to the left, their horses leaning into the curve with practiced ease. Evelyn felt Scout gather beneath her, his body shifting in preparation, and she let him take the turn his own way. He cut it tighter than the others, his hooves digging into the softer ground near the tree line, and came out of the turn half a length ahead of the woman on the gray. The woman cursed, loud enough for Evelyn to hear, and swung her horse wide, trying to box Scout in against the outer edge of the track. Evelyn saw it coming. She didn't fight it, she just waited, her body low, her hands steady, and when the woman's mare drifted too far to the right, Scout shot through the gap on the inside like he'd been waiting for it all along. The woman shouted something Evelyn didn't catch, but it didn't matter. They were past her now, and the only riders ahead were the man with the scar and the wiry rider on the chestnut. The chestnut was fast, faster than Evelyn had expected. It pulled ahead by 2 lengths, then 3. Its rider crouched low and tight against its neck, driving it forward with sharp, precise movements. The man with the scar was right behind it, his horse foaming at the mouth, its eyes wild with exertion. Evelyn felt Scout strain beneath her, his breathing hard but controlled, his body still moving with that same powerful rhythm. She knew he had more to give, but she also knew Callahan's warning: don't burn out too early. The race was 1.5 miles, and they were barely halfway through. "Easy," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Not yet." Scout's ears flicked back toward her voice, and she felt him ease just slightly, conserving his strength. The chestnut hit the halfway point and started the long stretch back toward the starting line. The man with the scar tried to pass on the outside, but the wiry rider cut him off, forcing him wide. The man shouted something, his face twisted with anger, and drove his horse harder, trying to close the gap. Evelyn watched it all unfold from 20 yards back, her mind working through the angles, the distances, the weaknesses. The chestnut was fast, but its rider was pushing it too hard. The horse's stride was starting to shorten, its breathing labored. It wouldn't last. The man with the scar was stronger, his horse built for endurance, but he was too aggressive, too focused on forcing his way past the chestnut instead of finding a smarter route, which meant the opening would come. Evelyn just had to be ready when it did. They hit the three-quarter mark, and the chestnut started to fade. Its rider felt it too. Evelyn could see the panic in the way he twisted in his seat, demanding more speed the horse didn't have. The man with the scar saw the weakness and drove forward, pulling even with the chestnut on the outside. And that's when Evelyn made her move. She leaned forward, her mouth close to Scout's ear. Now, Scout exploded forward like he'd been shot from a cannon. The power beneath her was almost violent, his body surging with a force that took her breath away. They closed the gap to the lead riders in seconds, and before either of them realized what was happening, Scout shot through the narrow space between them, his body threading the gap with inches to spare. The man with the scar shouted in surprise, jerking his reins too hard, and his horse stumbled slightly, losing momentum. The wiry rider cursed and tried to cut Scout off, but it was too late. Scout was already past, his hooves pounding the ground in a rhythm that sounded like war drums. Evelyn didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, her body moving with Scout's stride, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The starting line was visible now, maybe 300 yards ahead, and there was nothing between them and the finish except open ground. Behind her, she could hear the other riders shouting, their horses straining to catch up. But Scout didn't slow. If anything, he ran faster, his body stretched out in a full gallop that felt like flying. 200 yards. Evelyn's hands were numb from gripping Scout's mane, her legs aching from the effort of staying balanced. But she didn't care. All that mattered was the line ahead, getting closer with every stride. 100 yards. The crowd along the edges had started shouting, their voices rising in a chaotic roar that blended into one massive wave of sound. Evelyn couldn't make out individual words, couldn't tell if they were cheering for her or against her. It didn't matter. 50 yards. Scout's breathing was harsh now, his sides heaving, but he didn't slow. He drove forward with everything he had, his hooves tearing up the dirt in great clods that sprayed behind them. And then they crossed the line. Evelyn felt the moment it happened, the sudden shift from desperate effort to stunned relief. Scout slowed gradually, his body still powerful, but no longer straining, and Evelyn let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. They'd won. She didn't fully process it until she heard Thomas shouting her name from somewhere in the crowd. She turned Scout toward the sound and saw her father running toward her, his face flushed, his eyes bright with something that looked like disbelief and pride and fear all mixed together. Cormac was right behind him, grinning so wide it looked painful. "You did it, you crazy, reckless girl. You actually did it." Evelyn slid off Scout's back on shaking legs and nearly collapsed. Thomas caught her, steadying her, and for a moment they just stood there, both of them breathing hard, both of them unable to speak. "You all right?" Thomas asked finally, his voice rough. Evelyn nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." Thomas pulled her into a hug so tight it hurt, and Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "Don't ever do that to me again." "We needed the money. I don't care. Don't ever—" He stopped, his voice breaking slightly. "Just don't." Evelyn hugged him back hard and didn't let go until her hand stopped shaking. When they finally pulled apart, Cormac was standing with Scout, checking the horse over for injuries. Scout looked tired but unhurt, his breathing already evening out, his eyes calm. "He's fine," Cormac said. "Bastard didn't even break a sweat." Evelyn walked over and rested her forehead against Scout's neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Scout snorted softly and nudged her shoulder with his nose, like he was saying, "What'd you expect?" The race marshal appeared a few minutes later with a leather pouch, heavy with coins. He handed it to Evelyn without ceremony, his expression unreadable. $300. Count it if you want. Evelyn took the pouch, her hand still trembling slightly. "I trust you." The marshal's mouth twitched. "Smart girl. You ride well, better than most men I've seen." "Thanks." He nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing there with $300 in her hands and the weight of what she'd just done settling over her like a blanket. Thomas took the pouch from her gently. "Let's get out of here." They didn't wait around for the celebrations or the aftermath. They loaded Scout into the wagon, packed up their supplies, and left Fletcher County the same way they'd come, quiet, deliberate, and ready to put the whole thing behind them. The ride back was quieter than the ride there. Evelyn sat in the back of the wagon again, watching the landscape roll past, her mind still replaying the race in fragments. The chaos at the start, the way Scout had threaded through the pack, the final desperate sprint to the finish line. It all felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But the pouch of coins in Thomas's coat was real, and the relief on her father's face was real, and that was enough. They reached the ranch just after sunset. Cormac unhitched the wagon while Thomas helped Evelyn get Scout settled in the paddock. The horse was still calm, almost eerily so, like the race had been nothing more than a casual afternoon ride. "You think he knows what he did?" Evelyn asked, watching Scout graze near the fence. Thomas smiled faintly. "I think he knows exactly what he did." They stood together in silence for a moment, the evening air cool and still around them. Then Thomas said, "You know what this means, right?" "What?" "We've got enough to pay Crow, and enough left over to keep the ranch running through winter." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Yeah. You did that, Evie. You saved us." She looked at him, surprised by the rawness in his voice. "We did it together." Thomas shook his head. "No, this was you. Don't let anyone tell you different." Evelyn didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and looked back at Scout. That night, Thomas sat at the kitchen table and counted out the money, separating it into neat piles. 200 for Crow, the rest for supplies and winter provisions. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. "What do we do about Crow?" Cormac asked from the doorway. "We pay him," Thomas said. "First thing tomorrow. I want this done." "You think he'll take it and let it go?" Thomas's expression hardened. "He doesn't have a choice. We've got the money, and he's got witnesses to the deal. If he tries to back out now, the whole county'll know he's a liar. And if he doesn't care what the county thinks, then we'll deal with it." Thomas folded the money carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. "But one way or another, this ends tomorrow." Evelyn, standing in the hallway just out of sight, listened to the conversation and felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wanted to believe it was over, that paying Crow would be the end of it. But something told her it wouldn't be that simple. Men like Crow didn't lose gracefully, and they sure as hell didn't forget. Morning came cold and gray, the kind of dawn that felt more like an ending than a beginning. Thomas was already awake when Evelyn came downstairs, sitting at the table with the folded money in front of him and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that came from knowing a fight was coming and not knowing how it would end. "You ready?" Evelyn asked. Thomas looked up at her and nodded once. "Let's get this over with." They rode out together, Thomas, Evelyn, and Cormac, leaving the ranch in the hands of 2 hired men who'd been with them since spring. The money sat heavy in Thomas's coat pocket, $200 that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Nobody spoke during the ride. There was nothing left to say. Crow's property appeared on the horizon just after 8, a sprawling ranch that made the Aldridge land look small and struggling by comparison. Whitewashed fences stretched for miles, cattle grazed in pastures so green they looked unreal, and the main house sat at the center of it all like a monument to everything Crow had built by crushing people smaller than him. Thomas reined up in the gate and waited. He didn't have to wait long. One of Crow's men appeared within minutes, a lean, hard-faced ranch hand named Dutch, who'd been with Crow for years. Dutch looked at Thomas, then at Evelyn, and his mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Didn't expect to see you here," Dutch said. "I'm here to settle a debt," Thomas said evenly. "Crow around?" "He's around." Dutch's eyes flicked to the bulge in Thomas's coat. "You got the money?" "Every dollar." Dutch studied him for a moment, then nodded and opened the gate. "Follow me." They rode through Crow's property in silence, past barns and corrals and workers who stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, cold and assessing, and she kept her gaze straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of looking uncomfortable. Crow was waiting for them on the porch of the main house, standing with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He looked older in the morning light, the lines around his eyes deeper, his mouth set in a permanent frown. When Thomas dismounted and approached, Crow didn't move. "Harlan," Thomas said. "Thomas." Crow's eyes shifted to Evelyn, still mounted, still watching. "Brought the girl," That's bold. I brought my daughter, Thomas said, and I brought your money. He pulled the folded bills from his coat and held them out. Crow took them slowly, counted them in silence, his fingers moving with deliberate precision. When he finished, he looked up. $200. As agreed. As agreed, Thomas echoed. Crow folded the money and tucked it into his own coat. For a moment, Evelyn thought that would be the end of it. Crow would take the money, they'd leave, and it would finally be over. But Crow didn't step aside. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Thomas, and when he spoke, his voice was low and cold. You think this makes us square? Thomas's jaw tightened. The debt's paid. We're done. The debt's paid, Crow agreed, but we're not done. Not even close. What the hell are you talking about? Crow's expression didn't change. You humiliated me, Thomas, in front of the entire county. You put a girl on a horse and made me look like a fool. You think $200 fixes that? I think you lost a race fair and square, and now you're looking for an excuse to keep this going. Crow's eyes narrowed. Careful. Or what? Thomas stepped closer, his voice rising. You've got your money, the lien's settled. What else do you want? Respect, Crow said quietly. Something you seem to have forgotten how to give. The two men stared at each other, the air between them thick with tension. Evelyn felt her heart pounding in her chest, her hands gripping the reins so tight her knuckles had gone white. Cormac shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward his belt, ready for whatever came next. And then, from somewhere behind them, a voice cut through the silence. Let it go, Harlan. Everyone turned. An older woman stood in the doorway of the house, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined with years of hard living. Evelyn recognized her from town. Margaret Crow, Harlan's wife, a woman who rarely spoke but whose presence carried weight when she did. Crow's expression tightened. This doesn't concern you, Margaret. It does when you're about to do something stupid. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed. The man paid you. The debt's settled. You want to keep this fight going, you do it without dragging the rest of us into it. Stay out of this. I won't. Margaret's voice was sharp, cutting. You lost a race, Harlan. It happens. But you keep pushing this, and you're going to lose a lot more than a race. People are already talking. They're saying you can't handle losing. You keep this up, and they'll start saying worse. Crow's jaw worked, his hands clenching at his sides. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he turned back to Thomas, his expression hard. You're right, Crow said finally. The debt's settled. You can go. Thomas didn't move. Just like that? Just like that. Crow's voice was flat, controlled. But you remember something, Thomas? You beat me once. Don't expect it to happen again. I don't expect anything from you except to stay off my land. Crow's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond. He just turned and walked back into the house, leaving Margaret standing on the porch, watching them with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been something else entirely. You should go, Margaret said quietly, before he changes his mind. Thomas nodded once, then turned and mounted his horse. Evelyn and Cormac followed, and they rode out of Crow's property in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like dust. They didn't speak until they were halfway home. Finally, Cormac let out a slow breath and said, That was close. Too close, Thomas agreed. Evelyn looked at her father. You think he meant it? That we're done? Thomas was quiet for a moment. I think he meant it for now, but men like Crow don't forget. We'll have to watch our backs. For how long? As long as it takes. Evelyn nodded, her stomach twisting with unease. But there was nothing they could do about it now. The debt was paid, the land was theirs, and for the moment, that had to be enough. When they reached the ranch, Callahan was waiting for them on the porch, looking thinner and paler than he had a week ago. He stood slowly when they approached, his breathing labored, his hand braced against the wall for support. How'd it go? He asked. It's done, Thomas said. Crow took the money. Callahan nodded, his expression relieved. Good. That's good. Evelyn dismounted and walked over to him. You all right? You look worse. I'm fine, Callahan said, but his voice lacked conviction. He coughed, hard enough to double him over, and when he straightened, there was blood on his hand. Evelyn's eyes widened. Callahan, I'm fine, he said again, more firmly this time. Just need to rest. Thomas helped him back inside, and Evelyn stood on the porch, watching them go, her chest tight with worry. Callahan had been getting worse for weeks, and everyone knew it. The knife wound that had never healed right was finally catching up with him, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. That night, Evelyn sat with Callahan in the bunkhouse while he rested on his cot, his breathing shallow and uneven. He looked small in the dim light, his face gaunt, his hands trembling slightly. You should have seen yourself out there, Callahan said quietly, his voice weak but steady. In that race. You rode like you were born to it. Evelyn smiled faintly. I was scared the whole time. Good riders usually are. It's the ones who aren't scared that get themselves killed. He paused, coughing softly. You saved your family, Evelyn. Don't forget that. I couldn't have done it without you. Callahan shook his head. You did it without me. I just gave you the tools. You're the one who used them. Evelyn's throat tightened and she had to look away. Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. We both know that's not true. Callahan's voice was gentle, almost kind. But that's all right. I've had a good run, and I got to see you become the rider I always knew you could be. That's worth something. Evelyn wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for crying. You're not allowed to die yet. We still need you. No, you don't. Callahan smiled faintly. You've got everything you need right here. He tapped his chest, then pointed at her. Trust yourself the way you trust Scout. That's all you got to do. Evelyn stayed with him until he fell asleep, his breathing slow and ragged. Then she slipped out of the bunkhouse and stood in the yard, staring up at the stars, trying to make sense of the ache in her chest. Callahan died 3 days later, quietly, in his sleep. They buried him under the cottonwood tree near the paddock, the place where he used to sit and watch Scout graze in the evenings. Thomas said a few words, Cormac said a few more, and Evelyn stood in silence, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes dry because she refused to cry in front of anyone. After the burial, she walked out to the paddock and found Scout standing near the fence, his ears pricked forward, his eyes calm. She climbed over the fence and sat beside him in the dirt, her back against the wood, her hands resting on her knees. He's gone, she said quietly. Callahan. He's gone. Scout lowered his head and nudged her shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself cry, finally, the tears coming hard and fast and unstoppable. Scout stayed beside her the whole time, solid and steady, like he always had been. Autumn settled over the ranch like a slow exhale, the days growing shorter, the nights colder. The North 40 flourished under Thomas's careful management, the creek running strong and clear through the property, feeding the land in ways that felt almost miraculous after years of struggling through drought. The cattle grew fat, the fields turned gold, and for the first time in longer than Thomas could remember, the ranch felt secure. Evelyn spent most of her time with Scout, riding the property in the early mornings before the work began, the two of them moving together with an ease that felt like second nature now. She didn't ride him hard anymore. She didn't need to. The races were behind them. The desperation that had driven her into Fletcher County faded into memory. Now it was just her and the horse and the quiet rhythm of hooves on dirt. Thomas watched her sometimes from the porch, coffee in hand, and marveled at the person she'd become. She was still his daughter, still stubborn and reckless and too brave for her own good. But she was also something else now. Something stronger, more certain, like she'd found a part of herself she hadn't known was missing. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Thomas found her sitting on the paddock fence, watching Scout graze. He climbed up beside her, the wood creaking under his weight, and they sat in silence for a while. You ever think about racing again? Thomas asked finally. Evelyn shook her head. No, that part's done. You sure? You were good at it. I was desperate, Evelyn corrected. There's a difference. Thomas smiled faintly. Fair enough. They sat together watching the light fade, and after a while Evelyn said, You think Crow's really done with us? I think he's smart enough to know when to quit, but I also think he's too proud to forget. Thomas paused. We'll keep an eye on him, but we don't live our lives afraid of what he might do. We just live. Evelyn nodded, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could believe that. Winter came hard that year, the kind of cold that made your bones ache and your breath freeze in the air. But the ranch was ready. They had supplies, they had water, they had cattle that could survive the freeze. And when the first snow fell, blanketing the property in white, Thomas stood on the porch and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Evelyn came out a few minutes later, wrapped in a heavy coat, her breath misting in the cold. "You all right?" "Yeah," Thomas said. "I'm good." "You sure? You've got that look." "What look?" "The one where you're thinking too hard about things." Thomas smiled. "Maybe, but they're good things this time." Evelyn leaned against the porch rail beside him, and they stood together in silence, watching the snow fall over the land they'd fought so hard to keep. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Evelyn said after a while. "What?" "How none of this would have happened if I hadn't trusted Scout, or if you hadn't trusted me." She paused. "I think that's the thing people don't understand. Trust isn't something you just have, it's something you build. And it takes time, and it's messy, and sometimes it's scary as hell. But if you don't have it, you've got nothing." Thomas looked at her, surprised by the weight in her words. "When'd you get so smart?" Evelyn grinned. "I've always been this smart. You just weren't paying attention." Thomas laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and for a moment everything felt right in a way it hadn't in years. Spring came, and with it, new life. The cattle calved, the fields turned green, and the ranch thrived in ways Thomas had almost forgotten were possible. Crow kept his distance, his threats fading into nothing more than memory. Word around the county was that he'd lost more than just a race. He'd lost the fear people had of him, and without that fear his power was just smoke. Evelyn turned 20 that spring, and Thomas marked the occasion with a quiet dinner on the porch, just the two of them, and Cormac, sharing stories and laughter under the stars. When the meal was done and Cormac had retreated to the bunkhouse, Thomas handed Evelyn a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a silver bridle, simple and elegant, with her name engraved along the leather strap. Evelyn stared at it, her throat tightening. "It was your mother's," Thomas said quietly. "She rode with it when she was your age. I've been saving it. Thought maybe it was time you had it." Evelyn ran her fingers over the engraving, her vision blurring with tears. "Dad—" "You've earned it," Thomas said. "More than earned it. And I think she'd be proud of you. I know I am." Evelyn set the box down and hugged him, hard and fierce, and Thomas held her like he'd held her when she was a child, before the world had gotten so complicated, before loss and fear and desperation had shaped them into the people they were now. When they finally pulled apart, Evelyn wiped at her eyes and laughed, embarrassed. "I'm a mess." "You're allowed to be." She picked up the bridle again, turning it over in her hands, and smiled. "I'm going to put this on Scout tomorrow. See how he likes it." "He'll like it," Thomas said. "He likes everything you do." The next morning, Evelyn walked out to the paddock with the bridle in hand. Scout was waiting for her, as he always was, his ears pricked forward, his eyes calm. She approached slowly, letting him see the bridle, smell it, get used to the feel of it in her hands. "This was my mom's," she said quietly. "She loved horses like I do. I think you would have liked her." Scout lowered his head, and Evelyn slipped the bridle on gently, adjusting the straps until it fit perfectly. When she stepped back to look at him, something in her chest eased. He looked right, like he'd been waiting for this all along. She swung onto his back, no saddle, just the bridle in her hands, and the trust they'd built over months of quiet mornings and desperate races and moments where everything could have gone wrong but didn't. They rode together through the property, past the North 40, past the creek, past the cottonwood tree where Callahan was buried. The sun rose over the hills, casting long shadows across the land, and Evelyn felt something settle inside her. Not contentment exactly, but something close. A sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. When they finally stopped near the edge of the property, Evelyn slid off Scout's back and stood beside him, her hand resting on his neck. "You know what I think?" she said quietly. "I think people spend their whole lives looking for something they can trust, something solid, something that won't let them down when everything else falls apart." Scout's ears flicked toward her voice. "And I think most people never find it," she continued. "But I did. And it's not perfect, and it's not easy, and it sure as hell isn't safe. But it's real. And that's all that matters." Scout turned his head and nudged her shoulder, and Evelyn smiled. Yeah, she said, you get it. Years later, when people asked Evelyn about the races, the one against Crow, the one in Fletcher County, she'd tell them the truth. She'd been scared. She'd been desperate. She'd made mistakes, taken risks she probably shouldn't have, and come closer to losing everything than she ever wanted to admit. But she'd also learned something those races taught her in ways nothing else could. Courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and doing it anyway. Trust wasn't about knowing everything would work out. It was about believing in someone, or something, enough to take the leap even when you couldn't see the landing. And strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up every single time you did. The ranch thrived. The Aldridge name became synonymous with resilience in a county that valued toughness above almost everything else. And Scout, the roan horse that had once been too wild for anyone to ride, became a legend in his own right. Not because he was the fastest, though he was, but because he'd chosen his rider when it mattered most. Thomas watched his daughter grow into a woman who could run a ranch, manage men twice her age, and command respect without ever raising her voice. He watched her ride Scout through the property every morning, the two of them moving together like they were parts of the same whole, and he knew that whatever happened next, she'd be ready for it. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting over the North 40, Thomas would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and think about everything they'd survived. The losses, the fights, the moments when it felt like the world was trying to break them. They'd survived it all. Not because they were perfect or lucky or even particularly smart, but because when it mattered most, they'd trusted each other. And that, Thomas realized, was the only thing that ever really counted. The ranch endured. The land endured. And the bond between a stubborn girl and a wild horse endured long after the races were forgotten and the debts were paid and the threats had faded into nothing. Because some things, once built, can't be broken. Not by fear, not by loss, not by anything. And that was the lesson Evelyn carried with her for the rest of her life. Not in words, but in the quiet certainty that came from knowing she'd found something worth fighting for. And she'd fought for it with everything she had. And she'd won. You said part 5, lưu ý. Viết 12.000 đến 12.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 5. Lưu ý. Viết 12.000 đến 12.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả quá mượt mà và hoàn hảo, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện, điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more. 13:5 to 38, Claude responded. Part 5, Part 5. Morning came cold and gray, the kind of dawn that felt more like an ending than a beginning. Thomas was already awake when Evelyn came downstairs, sitting at the table with the folded money in front of him and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that came from knowing a fight was coming and not knowing how it would end. You ready? Evelyn asked. Thomas looked up at her and nodded once. Let's get this over with. They rode out together, Thomas, Evelyn, and Cormac, leaving the ranch in the hands of 2 hired men who'd been with them since spring. The money sat heavy in Thomas's coat pocket, $200 that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Nobody spoke during the ride. There was nothing left to say. Crow's property appeared on the horizon just after 8, a sprawling ranch that made the Aldridge land look small and struggling by comparison. Whitewashed fences stretched for miles. Cattle grazed in pastures so green they looked unreal. And the main house sat at the center of it all, like a monument to everything Crow had built by crushing people smaller than him. Thomas reined up at the gate and waited. He didn't have to wait long. One of Crow's men appeared within minutes, a lean, hard-faced ranch hand named Dutch, who'd been with Crow for years. Dutch looked at Thomas, then at Evelyn, and his mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Didn't expect to see you here," Dutch said. "I'm here to settle a debt," Thomas said evenly. "Crow around?" "He's around." Dutch's eyes flicked to the bulge in Thomas's coat. "You got the money?" "Every dollar." Dutch studied him for a moment, then nodded and opened the gate. "Follow me." They rode through Crow's property in silence, past barns and corrals and workers who stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, cold and assessing, and she kept her gaze straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of looking uncomfortable. Crow was waiting for them on the porch of the main house, standing with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He looked older in the morning light, the lines around his eyes deeper, his mouth set in a permanent frown. When Thomas dismounted and approached, Crow didn't move. "Harlan," Thomas said. "Thomas." Crow's eyes shifted to Evelyn, still mounted, still watching. "Brought the girl. That's bold." "I brought my daughter," Thomas said. "And I brought your money." He pulled the folded bills from his coat and held them out. Crow took them slowly, counted them in silence, his fingers moving with deliberate precision. When he finished, he looked up. $200, as agreed. "As agreed," Thomas echoed. Crow folded the money and tucked it into his own coat. For a moment, Evelyn thought that would be the end of it. Crow would take the money, they'd leave, and it would finally be over. But Crow didn't step aside. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Thomas, and when he spoke, his voice was low and cold. "You think this makes us square?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "The debt's paid. We're done." "The debt's paid," Crow agreed, "but we're not done. Not even close." "What the hell are you talking about?" Crow's expression didn't change. "You humiliated me, Thomas, in front of the entire county. You put a girl on a horse and made me look like a fool. You think $200 fixes that? I think you lost a race fair and square, and now you're looking for an excuse to keep this going." Crow's eyes narrowed. "Careful." "Or what?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice rising. "You've got your money. The lien's settled. What else do you want?" "Respect," Crow said quietly. "Something you seem to have forgotten how to give." The two men stared at each other, the air between them thick with tension. Evelyn felt her heart pounding in her chest, her hands gripping the reins so tight her knuckles had gone white. Cormac shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward his belt, ready for whatever came next. And then from somewhere behind them, a voice cut through the silence. "Let it go, Harlan." Everyone turned. An older woman stood in the doorway of the house, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined with years of hard living. Evelyn recognized her from town. Margaret Crow, Harlan's wife, a woman who rarely spoke but whose presence carried weight when she did. Crow's expression tightened. "This doesn't concern you, Margaret." "It does when you're about to do something stupid." Margaret stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed. "The man paid you. The debt's settled. You want to keep this fight going? You do it without dragging the rest of us into it. Stay out of this." "I won't." Margaret's voice was sharp, cutting. "You lost a race, Harlan. It happens. But you keep pushing this, and you're going to lose a lot more than a race. People are already talking. They're saying you can't handle losing. You keep this up, and they'll start saying worse." Crow's jaw worked, his hands clenching at his sides. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he turned back to Thomas, his expression hard. "You're right," Crow said finally. "The debt's settled. You can go." Thomas didn't move. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Crow's voice was flat, controlled. "But you remember something, Thomas. You beat me once. Don't expect it to happen again." "I don't expect anything from you except to stay off my land." Crow's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond. He just turned and walked back into the house, leaving Margaret standing on the porch, watching them with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been something else entirely. "You should go," Margaret said quietly. "Before he changes his mind." Thomas nodded once, then turned and mounted his horse. Evelyn and Cormac followed, and they rode out of Crow's property in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like dust. They didn't speak until they were halfway home. Finally, Cormac let out a slow breath and said, "That was close." "Too close," Thomas agreed. Evelyn looked at her father. "You think he meant it? That we're done?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I think he meant it for now, but men like Crow don't forget. We'll have to watch our backs." "For how long?" "As long as it takes." Evelyn nodded, her stomach twisting with unease. But there was nothing they could do about it now. The debt was paid, the land was theirs, and for the moment that had to be enough. When they reached the ranch, Callahan was waiting for them on the porch, looking thinner and paler than he had a week ago. He stood slowly when they approached, his breathing labored, his hand braced against the wall for support. "How'd it go?" he asked. "It's done," Thomas said. "Crow took the money." Callahan nodded, his expression relieved. "Good. That's good." Evelyn dismounted and walked over to him. "You all right? You look worse." "I'm fine," Callahan said, but his voice lacked conviction. He coughed, hard enough to double him over, and when he straightened, there was blood on his hand. Evelyn's eyes widened. "Callahan, I'm fine," he said again, more firmly this time. "Just need to rest." Thomas helped him back inside, and Evelyn stood on the porch, watching them go, her chest tight with worry. Callahan had been getting worse for weeks, and everyone knew it. The knife wound that had never healed right was finally catching up with him, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. That night, Evelyn sat with Callahan in the bunkhouse while he rested on his cot, his breathing shallow and uneven. He looked small in the dim light, his face gaunt, his hands trembling slightly. "You should have seen yourself out there," Callahan said quietly, his voice weak but steady. "In that race. You rode like you were born to it." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I was scared the whole time." "Good riders usually are. It's the ones who aren't scared that get themselves killed." He paused, coughing softly. "You saved your family, Evelyn. Don't forget that." "I couldn't have done it without you." Callahan shook his head. "You did it without me. I just gave you the tools. You're the one who used them." Evelyn's throat tightened, and she had to look away. "Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." "We both know that's not true." Callahan's voice was gentle, almost kind. "But that's all right. I've had a good run, and I got to see you become the rider I always knew you could be. That's worth something." Evelyn wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for crying. "You're not allowed to die yet. We still need you." "No, you don't." Callahan smiled faintly. "You've got everything you need right here." He tapped his chest, then pointed at her. "Trust yourself the way you trust Scout. That's all you got to do." Evelyn stayed with him until he fell asleep, his breathing slow and ragged. Then she slipped out of the bunkhouse and stood in the yard, staring up at the stars, trying to make sense of the ache in her chest. Callahan died 3 days later, quietly, in his sleep. They buried him under the cottonwood tree near the paddock, the place where he used to sit and watch Scout graze in the evenings. Thomas said a few words, Cormac said a few more, and Evelyn stood in silence, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes dry because she refused to cry in front of anyone. After the burial, she walked out to the paddock and found Scout standing near the fence, his ears pricked forward, his eyes calm. She climbed over the fence and sat beside him in the dirt, her back against the wood, her hands resting on her knees. "He's gone," she said quietly. "Callahan. He's gone." Scout lowered his head and nudged her shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself cry. Finally, the tears coming hard and fast and unstoppable. Scout stayed beside her the whole time, solid and steady, like he always had been. The days after Callahan's death blurred together in a haze of work and grief that Evelyn couldn't quite shake. She threw herself into the ranch, mending fences that didn't need mending, hauling water that could have waited, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from circling back to the empty space Callahan had left behind. Thomas watched her with worried eyes, but didn't say anything. He knew grief well enough to know it couldn't be rushed. Autumn settled over the ranch like a slow exhale, the days growing shorter, the nights colder. The North 40 flourished under Thomas's careful management, the creek running strong and clear through the property, feeding the land in ways that felt almost miraculous after years of struggling through drought. The cattle grew fat, the fields turned gold, and for the first time in longer than Thomas could remember, the ranch felt secure. But security, Evelyn was learning, came with its own kind of weight. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, now that they weren't fighting for survival every single day, she found herself facing questions she'd been too busy to ask before. What came next? What was she supposed to do with her life now that the races were over and the debts were paid? The ranch would run itself, more or less, with Thomas and Cormac managing the day-to-day operations. Where did that leave her? She spent most of her time with Scout, riding the property in the early mornings before the work began, the two of them moving together with an ease that felt like second nature now. She didn't ride him hard anymore. She didn't need to. The races were behind them. The desperation that had driven her into Fletcher County faded into memory. Now, it was just her and the horse and the quiet rhythm of hooves on dirt. One morning, about 2 weeks after Callahan's burial, Evelyn rode Scout out to the North 40 and sat on his back near the creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones. The land stretched out around her, peaceful and still, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief, exactly, but something adjacent to it. A recognition of how much had changed and how much of that change she'd been responsible for. "You know what I think?" she said to Scout, her voice quiet. "I think Callahan knew he was dying when he agreed to help me train. I think he knew he didn't have much time left, and he spent it teaching me because he figured that was the most useful thing he could do." Scout's ears flicked back toward her voice. "And I think that's what people do when they know their time's running out," she continued. "They stop worrying about themselves and start thinking about what they can leave behind, what they can give to the people who are going to keep going after they're gone." She paused, running her hand along Scout's neck. "I want to be like that. Not the dying part, but the part where you spend your time on things that matter, things that last." Scout turned his head slightly, and Evelyn smiled. "Yeah, I know. Easier said than done." She sat there for a long time, watching the creek, thinking about Callahan and her mother and all the people who'd shaped her into who she was. And slowly, quietly, she started to understand what she wanted to do with the second chance they'd fought so hard to earn. That evening, Evelyn found Thomas on the porch, going over ledgers by lantern light. She sat down beside him, and he looked up, surprised. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" Evelyn took a breath. "I want to start training horses. Properly. Not just riding them, but working with the ones that nobody else can handle. The ones people give up on." Thomas set down his pencil. "Like Scout. Like Scout. There's a lot of horses out there that get written off because they're too difficult or too stubborn or too scared. But most of them aren't broken. They just need someone who's willing to take the time to understand them." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "That's a big commitment." "I know, but I think it's what I'm supposed to do. Callahan spent his last few months teaching me because he believed I could do something with it. I don't want to waste that." Thomas studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right. What do you need from me?" "Space, time, and maybe help spreading the word that I'm taking on horses for training." "You got it." Thomas reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "Your mother would be proud, you know, what you're doing." Evelyn's throat tightened. "You think?" "I know." He smiled faintly. She was always the one who believed people could change, that given the right circumstances, anyone could become better than they were. Sounds like you inherited that from her. Evelyn looked away, blinking hard. "Thanks, Dad." "Don't thank me. Just do good work. That's all I ask." Word spread quickly once Evelyn started taking on horses. The first one came from a rancher 2 counties over, a young mare that had thrown 3 riders and was on the verge of being sold for slaughter. Evelyn took her on, spending weeks just sitting with the horse, letting her get used to human presence without pressure or expectation. When she finally climbed on the mare's back, it was without fanfare or ceremony. The horse shifted beneath her, tense but not panicked, and Evelyn just sat there, breathing with her, until the mare's muscles relaxed and she took her first tentative steps forward. The second horse was a gelding with a vicious streak, known for biting anyone who got too close. Evelyn spent hours studying his behavior, watching for the patterns, the triggers, the moments when fear turned into aggression. She worked with him slowly, patiently, never pushing, never forcing, just offering him choices and letting him decide when he was ready to trust. By winter, she'd trained 4 horses, and every single one had gone back to their owners calmer, more manageable, more willing to work. People started talking. They started bringing her horses from farther and farther away, and Evelyn found herself doing work that felt meaningful in ways the races never had. "You know what the difference is," she said to Cormac one evening, while they were mending tack in the barn. "Between racing and this?" Cormac looked up from the bridle he was oiling. "What?" "Racing was about proving something, to Crow, to the county, to myself. But this isn't about proving anything. It's about helping something that's struggling become what it's supposed to be." Cormac nodded slowly. "That's a good way to look at it. Callahan used to say that good riders don't break horses. They just help them find their courage. I didn't really understand what he meant until I started doing this." "He'd be proud of you," Cormac said. "Stubborn old bastard always knew you had this in you." Evelyn smiled, her chest warm. "Yeah, I think he did." Winter passed, then spring, and the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Thomas managed the cattle in the fields, Cormac handled the day-to-day operations, and Evelyn worked with the horses, building a reputation that spread far beyond their county. People stopped thinking of her as the girl who'd raced against Crow and started thinking of her as someone who could solve problems other trainers couldn't. But not everyone was happy about it. Crow's shadow still hung over the county, and though he'd kept his distance from the Aldridge Ranch, Evelyn could feel his presence in the way certain people avoided her in town, the way conversations would stop when she walked into the general store. Crow hadn't forgotten. He'd just been waiting. The confrontation came in late spring, almost a full year after Evelyn had beaten him in the race. She was in town picking up supplies when she ran into him outside the feed store. He was alone, which was unusual. Crow rarely went anywhere without at least one of his men, and he looked older, his face more lined, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes were still hard, still calculating. "Evelyn," he said, his voice neutral. "Mr. Crow." They stood there for a moment, sizing each other up. Then Crow said, "Heard you're training horses now." "That's right. Doing well, from what I hear." "Well enough." Crow nodded slowly. "That's good. Means you're using your talents for something productive instead of making trouble." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I wasn't making trouble. I was saving my family's ranch. By humiliating me in front of the entire county. By beating you fair and square." Evelyn met his eyes directly. "You had a problem with that. You should have raced better." Crow's expression darkened, but before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" They both turned. Margaret Crow stood a few feet away, a basket of groceries in her hands, her expression calm but watchful. Crow's jaw tightened. "No problem." "Good." Margaret's eyes shifted to Evelyn. "I've heard about your work with horses. People say you're very good." Evelyn hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Thank you." Margaret nodded, then looked at her husband. "We should go, Harlan." Crow stared at Evelyn for another long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Margaret followed, but not before giving Evelyn a look that might have been approval or might have been warning. Evelyn couldn't tell. She stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, then grabbed her supplies and headed back to the ranch. When she told Thomas what had happened, he listened in silence, his expression grim. "You think he's going to cause trouble?" Evelyn asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, but we keep doing what we're doing. We don't let him dictate how we live." "And if he tries something?" "Then we deal with it." Thomas's voice was firm. "But we don't live in fear of him, Evie. That's what he wants. And I'll be damned if I give him that." Evelyn nodded, trying to believe him. Summer came, and with it, a horse that would change everything. The animal arrived on a hot afternoon in July, hauled in a trailer by a rancher named Samuel Black, who looked like he'd been through hell. The horse inside was a black stallion, massive and wild-eyed, kicking at the walls of the trailer with enough force to shake the whole rig. "Name's Dante," Black said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I've had him 2 years, and I can't do a damn thing with him. He's thrown 4 riders, kicked 2 stable hands, and nearly killed himself trying to break out of his stall. I'm at the end of my rope. You're my last shot before I put him down." Evelyn walked around the trailer, studying the stallion through the slats. Dante's eyes were rolling, his nostrils flared, his entire body coiled with tension and rage. But beneath the aggression, Evelyn saw something else. Fear. Raw, desperate fear. "What happened to him?" she asked. "Previous owner used to beat him. By the time I got him, the damage was done. I thought I could fix it, but I was wrong." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Leave him with me. I'll see what I can do." Black looked skeptical. "You sure? This horse is dangerous." "So was Scout, and every other horse I've worked with." Evelyn met his eyes. "I'm sure." Working with Dante was the hardest thing Evelyn had ever done. The stallion didn't trust anyone, didn't respond to gentleness or patience or any of the techniques that had worked with other horses. He fought her at every turn, biting, kicking, refusing to eat when she was near. For the first 2 weeks, Evelyn couldn't even get within 10 feet of him without him trying to attack. But she didn't give up. Every morning, she'd sit outside his stall and just talk to him. She didn't try to touch him, didn't try to force proximity. She just sat there, letting him get used to her presence, her voice, the fact that she wasn't going to hurt him. Slowly, painfully slowly, Dante started to calm. He stopped trying to kick down the stall door. He stopped refusing food when she was nearby. And one morning, about 3 weeks in, he let her touch his neck without flinching. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Thomas watched from a distance, marveling at his daughter's patience. "I don't know how you do it," he said one evening. "Do what?" "Spend weeks working with a horse that might never come around." Evelyn shrugged. "Because he deserves a chance. Someone hurt him, made him this way. That's not his fault. And if I can help him learn to trust again, even a little, then it's worth it." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman she'd become. Strong, patient, fiercely compassionate in ways that reminded him so much of her mother, it hurt. "You know what I think?" Thomas said quietly. "I think you're doing something more important than saving horses. I think you're proving that people can change, that no matter how broken something is, it can heal if someone's willing to do the work." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "That's what I'm hoping." It took 3 months, but Evelyn finally got Dante to the point where she could ride him. The first time she climbed on his back, she half expected him to throw her. But he didn't. He just stood there, trembling slightly, his muscles tense but not violent, and when Evelyn urged him forward, he took a step, then another, then another. By the time Samuel Black came back to pick him up, Dante was a different horse, still strong, still spirited, but no longer consumed by fear and rage. Black stared at him in disbelief. How did you—" "Time," Evelyn said simply, "and patience, and the belief that he deserved better than what he got." Black paid her double what they'd agreed on, and when he led Dante into the trailer, the stallion went without a fight. After he left, Evelyn stood in the yard, exhausted and exhilarated, and realized something she hadn't quite understood before. This work, this slow, difficult, often frustrating work of helping broken things heal, was what she was meant to do. Not because it was easy or profitable or even particularly rewarding most of the time, but because it mattered. And that, she was learning, was enough. The years that followed were good ones. Not perfect. Nothing ever was. But good. The ranch thrived under Thomas's steady management, and Evelyn's reputation as a horse trainer grew until people were bringing her animals from 3 counties away. She worked with dozens of horses, each one different, each one teaching her something new about patience, trust, and the stubborn resilience of creatures that refused to stay broken. Scout stayed by her side through all of it, no longer the half-wild horse that nobody could touch. He'd become something else. A partner, a companion, a living reminder of everything they'd survived together. He was older now, his movements slower, his muzzle flecked with gray. But his eyes were still bright, still calm. And when Evelyn rode him through the property on quiet mornings, it felt like coming home. Thomas aged 2, his hair going white, his movements stiff with arthritis. But he was happy in a way Evelyn hadn't seen since before her mother died. He'd built something that lasted, something that would outlive him, and he took quiet pride in knowing his daughter would carry it forward. One evening in late autumn, nearly 5 years after the race that had changed everything, Thomas and Evelyn sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the North 40. The air was cool, the sky streaked with orange and gold, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You ever think about that race?" Thomas asked finally. "The one against Crow?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Sometimes. Feels like it happened to someone else. In a way, it did. You're not the same person you were back then." "Neither are you." Thomas nodded. "No, I guess I'm not." He paused. "You know what I learned from all that?" "What?" "That the hardest fights aren't always the ones you see coming. Sometimes they're the quiet ones. The ones where you have to decide whether to give up or keep going when there's no guarantee it'll work out. And the people who win those fights aren't the strongest or the smartest. They're just the ones who refuse to quit." Evelyn looked at him, her chest tight with emotion. "You think we won?" "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "I do. Because we're still here, and we didn't just survive. We built something better than what we had before." Evelyn reached over and took his hand, and they sat together in silence, watching the light fade over the land they'd fought so hard to keep. Scout died the following spring, quietly, in his sleep. Evelyn found him in the paddock one morning, lying in the grass near the fence, his body still and peaceful. She knelt beside him, her hand on his neck, and felt the weight of everything they'd been through together crash over her like a wave. She stayed with him for a long time, crying harder than she had since her mother died, grieving not just the horse, but the version of herself that had needed him so desperately. The frightened, desperate girl who'd climbed on his back with no idea if she'd survive the ride. The woman who'd learned to trust something wild and unpredictable and found out it had been waiting for her all along. They buried him under the cottonwood tree next to Callahan, and Thomas carved Scout's name into a wooden marker that would weather and fade with time but never quite disappear. "He was a good horse," Thomas said, standing beside Evelyn at the grave. "He was more than that," Evelyn said, her voice hoarse. "He saved us. All of us." Thomas nodded. "Yeah, he did." Life continued. It always did. Evelyn kept training horses, kept building her reputation, kept proving that patience and trust could heal wounds that force and fear never could. She married eventually, a quiet man named Daniel who worked cattle in the next county and understood the kind of love that came from shared work and mutual respect rather than grand gestures and empty promises. They had 2 daughters, both of whom learned to ride before they could walk, both of whom inherited their mother's stubborn refusal to give up on things other people had written off. Thomas lived long enough to see his granddaughters grow into young women who could run a ranch as well as any man in the county. He died peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 76, with Evelyn holding his hand and his granddaughters sitting vigil at the foot of his bed. They buried him next to his wife, and Evelyn stood at the grave and thought about everything he'd taught her, about resilience and sacrifice and the quiet courage it took to keep going when the world seemed determined to break you, about trust, and how it wasn't something you demanded or earned through force. It was something you built, slowly and carefully, one small choice at a time. Years later, when Evelyn was older and her daughters had daughters of their own, people would still ask her about the race, about the day she beat Harlan Crow in front of half the county, about the horse that nobody could ride except her, about the desperate gamble that saved her family's ranch. And Evelyn would tell them the truth, that she'd been terrified, that she'd made mistakes, taken risks she shouldn't have, come closer to losing everything than she ever wanted to admit. That Scout had been half wild and unpredictable and dangerous, and climbing on his back had been one of the stupidest things she'd ever done. But she'd also tell them what she learned. The courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done even when you were scared out of your mind. That trust wasn't a feeling or a gift. It was a choice you made every single day, even when it was hard, even when you had no guarantee it would work out. And that strength wasn't about never falling or never doubting or never feeling like you were in over your head. It was about getting back up every single time, about refusing to quit even when quitting would have been easier, about believing that broken things could heal and lost things could be found and desperate situations could be survived if you just refused to give up. The Aldridge Ranch endured long after Evelyn was gone, passed down through generations of women who carried her name and her stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The North 40 still ran with creek water, still sustained the cattle that kept the operation alive. And under the cottonwood tree near the paddock, 3 wooden markers stood in a row: Callahan, Scout, and Thomas. Silent witnesses to everything that had been fought for and won. Because some things, once built, couldn't be broken. Not by fear, not by loss, not by time. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the victories or the races or the moments of glory that people talked about for years afterward, but the quiet, steady refusal to give up. The daily choice to keep going, keep building, keep trusting, even when the world made it as hard as possible. That was the legacy Evelyn left behind. Not in grand gestures or heroic acts, but in the patient, unglamorous work of taking broken things and helping them heal. Of refusing to write off anything or anyone as beyond saving. Of proving, over and over, that courage and trust and stubborn resilience could carry you through just about anything if you let them. And on quiet mornings, when the light broke over the Texas hills and the ranch stirred to life with the sounds of horses and cattle and the voices of women who'd inherited Evelyn's strength without even realizing it, you could almost feel her presence. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as something deeper. A reminder that the hardest battles are often the quietest ones, and the greatest victories are the ones nobody sees coming. The ones where you refuse to quit even when the entire world is betting against you. And somehow, impossibly, you win.